Hello, I'm anti-woke and autistic. Now, I found something on Instagram that's absolutely ridiculous and it's part of this whole fat acceptance thing. Here it is. Why can't we accept that some people are naturally thin, but not that some are naturally fat? This is natural? This is natural? There's rhyme and reason to evolution. There's rhyme and reason to how the human body and all animal species evolved. There is nothing, evolutionarily speaking, that makes sense about this. This is not natural. How can anybody think this kind of body is natural? I mean, it's ridiculous. So just because some people could be naturally thin, that automatically means people can be naturally fat? Well, if that's true, if people are naturally fat, how do you explain the skyrocketing obesity rates in the US since the 1970s? Look at this chart, look at this graph. It just skyrockets. This has nothing to do with the population increase because we're talking about percentages, not absolute numbers. So according to the CDC, the prevalence of obesity in the US has increased substantially since the 1960s. From 1976 to 1980 to 2007 to 2008, obesity prevalence increased from 15% to 34% among adults and from 5% to 17% among children and adolescents. So looking back at 1960, it appears to be like 13% and kind of stabilized at maybe about 15% in the late 1970s, and then it just skyrockets, and it's continuing to. So there's about 350 million Americans, and about 115 million meet the criteria for obesity. Obesity is when you're 20% over your ideal weight, and morbid obesity is when you're 100 pounds plus, at least 100 pounds overweight. Let's look at that picture again. We can assume then during primitive times, ancient times, when all human beings were hunter-gatherers, that a good number of them were built like this. Now imagine being a hunter-gatherer, being in a hunter-gatherer society, caveman times, ancient times, whatever you want to call it, and you're built like this. Whether you're living in a hot climate or in the harsh northern climate, so whether you're in the southern climates where the sun is where it's just very hot all day long and you have to hunt and chase your dinner and you have to make sure you don't become somebody's dinner. So there's just a lot of trekking all day long, a lot of migrating, walking miles and miles and miles every day. You've heard of survival of the fittest. There's no way that if this were a natural part of the human species, that we would have survived as a species, whether it's in a hot climate or a cold climate. Imagine being in a frigid northern climate. Again, you're hunting woolly mammoths and trying to make sure you're battling the harsh elements. Now you might be thinking, well, if you have this much fat, it came in handy during times of famine. That might be true if you were like 10 pounds overweight or 15 pounds overweight. And if you're 15 pounds overweight, you can still survive. The human species could still survive pretty well as a hunter-gatherer if you're carrying around an extra 15 pounds. And you only need to carry around 10 or 15 pounds or even 20 pounds. You can still survive as a species. And if you're 20 pounds overweight during famines, that's more than sufficient, because sooner or later man would make a kill Man was very adept at hunting. He had projectile weapons. He was able to hunt and outsmart big, strong animals. But imagine walking miles and miles every day and you're carrying things. You've got babies slung over your back or attached to you in the front. On top of that, you've got 50 pounds of extra fat in your belly. You're walking and walking for days and days. You will not survive. Imagine a herd of zebra or gazelles or wolves or big cats. Do you ever see a fat zebra? Do you ever see a fat gazelle? Do you ever see a fat wolf? Do you ever see a fat hyena, a fat leopard, a fat lioness, a fat lion, a fat jaguar, a fat panther? You don't see fat animals in the wild because it contradicts survival. It's not natural. You don't see fat humans among hunter-gatherer societies. And there's no evidence that man was fat, or at least more than rarely during ancient times. And I'm not talking about Egyptians, where there might be some evidence of obesity, but the Egyptians weren't hunter-gatherers. They had agriculture. I'm talking about hunter-gatherers. Ancient man, primitive man, Stone Age. Just like a fat zebra, a fat prey animal, or a fat predator can't survive, like a fat lower primate, fat humans couldn't survive. It's not natural. Now, I know what you're thinking, well, what about hippos? They're fat. Actually, rhinos and elephants, that's all muscle. They're just big animals and it's muscle. Hippos, that is mostly muscle. It may look like they're obese or fat, but for their species, that's muscle. What about bears? Good point. Bears eat a lot before they hibernate, so they can put on a lot of fat. But here's the thing about bears. They can run like 30 miles an hour. They can efficiently hunt because they're big and very powerful with huge claws. Human beings don't run 30 miles an hour, and we don't have huge claws. So we can't afford to be naturally fat. A bear can get away with it. One swipe of a paw, and it kills its prey. It can chase down prey 30 miles an hour. The fastest human, like Usain Bolt, somewhere around 26 or 27 miles an hour. The fastest woman, elite sprinters, around 20 or 21 miles an hour. And those are elite, highly trained individuals. It's not natural to be this big. Oh, I know what you're thinking. What about dozens and dozens of genes that have been linked to obesity? Well, ever hear of that old saying, genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger? There is no gene that automatically makes a human being morbidly obese. There are genes that can predispose you to being overweight, but you can always counteract that with proper lifestyle. It might not be as easy for you as your naturally skinny neighbor who eats 3,000 calories a day and doesn't exercise, but they're skinny. But just because those kind of people exist doesn't mean that there are genes that automatically make people as big as a house. Let's look at that again. This is just nuts. These are people who have given up and resigned to a life of mobility impairment. It's lifestyle driven. Never mind that you have a friend who can eat as much as you want and stay thin. Never mind it. That's not relevant. Look, don't compare yourself to a whale or a bear or a hippo. Don't compare yourself to a creature that lives in the water, for God's sake. Obesity is not natural. It goes against evolution. It goes against nature. Please don't listen to the death cult that is known as fat acceptance. Have a good day.